speaker. Vinod, can you come over? And it's a privilege and an honor and a delight to introduce Vinod Shah. Many of you know him. In once my brother and mentor. Vinod was born in southern part of India in a Jain family. Jain, if you want to know what Jain is later, probably you can Google. And Christ invited him into a relationship with him while he was at college fellow doing his MBBS. Went on to become a surgeon, a pediatric surgeon. And soon after that, with indigenous Indian mission agency, along with Shalini and three young children moved to a tribal area, India, among the Garasi, and subsequently went on to become the medical secretary and CEO of Emmanuel Hospital Association, which is a chain of 20 hospitals in rural North India, where he was my boss and mentored many of us. Subsequently, he moved back to his alma mater, CMC Velo, in pediatric surgery department. Being a visionary, he could not be contained in the small surgery. He went on to establish the Department of Distance Education, which is headed by the team is here, and the family medicine program which we do now with CMC Velo was started by CMC, and then went on to become the CEO of ICMDA before Peter took over. Went back to surgery, which he gave up a month back, alongside established a for-profit company, missional company doing home care, which he's heading now. Mentored to many, a visionary. Many of us have journeyed with him and been blessed by him. Thank you, Vinod. Let me pray before you take over. As Vinod shares to us, we pray that it will not be Vinod who is speaking, but your spirit communicating to us. In your precious name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Samuel Johnson, the English lexicographer, the person who wrote the first English dictionary, he was asked to review a book by a young author. So he read the book and then he said, the book is both good and original, but what is good is not original, and what is original is not good. So, luckily, all that I have today is not original, and so is all good. The topic is justice in healthcare distribution. Next slide. And so I have these 5 major themes. I have put it down here because you will know that there is an end to this lecture. And so you can just sit back and relax. I have tried to make this subject as easy and as interesting as possible. We have these 5 things. One is, I start off with the WHO story, which started in 1948. And then I'm going to talk about the global inequities and inequality, both within countries, between countries, and within the countries. And then I'm going to talk about 2 major causes of this disparity. That is the political determinants and the social determinants. And then I'll touch on some distributive justice theories. And this is where it gets challenging, and the biblical position. And then I'm going to try to be more practical and tell you about what we can do in our national associations to reduce the disparities and inequities. But the most important part of the lecture is the impact of the inequities in our societies. Because I'm hoping that when you listen to those impact of what inequities can do to people, you will really sit up, and I hope you will get worried. So the story starts in 1946, when the World Health Organization made a very ambitious plan about enjoying the highest attainable standard of healthcare as a fundamental right of every human being on the planet. This means primary, secondary, tertiary care for every person. Now, only 50% of the countries have, after 75 years, accepted this as part of their fundamental right. Thank you. Can you keep it open? Yes. And there were reasons for not accepting. Why these 50% of the countries did not accept was because of two main important reasons. One was the financial feasibility, and the other is the ethical problems associated with this. Next slide. And why did they not accept the WHO position? Is because the healthcare care costs kept increasing, technology kept growing, starting with CT scans and MRI scans and PET scans and transplant surgery and so on and so forth. And it became impossible to be able to think of providing this sort of healthcare to every person on the planet. And then the numbers of people increased. In the developing nations, the population was increasing. In the developed nations, people were living longer, and so the numbers were actually increasing. And the final and the biggest challenge was, who is going to pay for all this? The rich. How long will the rich keep on subsidizing the care for the poor? Next slide. I'm sure you must be very aware about all the health disparities, but I just want you to look at the fourth row, maternal mortality. 462 per 100,000 in the low-income countries and 12 in the developed countries. As a huge, like 30 times the mortality. And then I want you to look at the row in the fifth, last but one column, the disease burden, diseases of the poor, which is tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV. 90% of the problem was in the low-income countries. And so there was a huge disparity between the countries. Next slide. And then 1% of the world population owned 46% of the world's wealth. And 1% of the world population had, 55% of the world population had only 1% of the wealth. So, such a huge disparity in global wealth. And global wealth also has a very close relationship with health. So it gets directly translated into the health scenario. Next slide. Now I was talking about the within the country disparities. Now this is actually more of a problem because disparities within the country affect the psyche of people more than disparities between countries. And within the country, in India, there is a big disparity between the low caste and the high caste in infant mortality rate and the under 5 mortality rate. Next. I've called this wealth is health because you can see people who are wealthy, their health is much better than people who are not. And the under 5 mortalities of the people, 20% of the lower strata have very high under 5 mortality. Next slide. And the most unequal nation in the world is the most richest nation in the world. the US mortality rate so different between the white and the black. Next slide. And the poverty, even though the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals have been working and been owned and much money has been poured into it, what has happened is at the end of the COVID epidemic, there is not any change in the poverty levels. It remains exactly the same. Next slide. Now, this is the global inequality. Before 1960, that means during the time of the geographical colonization, there was the geographical colonization. During that time, the disparity was not really much. It was like 10 times. And then the geographical colonization was over. And today, the disparity is like 40 times or 50 times. And so some people would call this the economic colonization or the neo-colonization. Next slide. Now, why are we talking about inequality and inequity? All of us here in this hall are people who are above the poverty line. We probably have some access to health, I'm sure, because we are doctors. And why do we have to worry if some people don't have access? Now, so far it was only a moral compulsion, but now there is going to be other important reasons why we have to act. Now, these are some books. The Broken Ladder. That means people cannot. They are trapped, people in poverty, they cannot get out. When there is inequity in a nation, they have produced evidence that there is decreased well-being, increased anxiety, and reduced trust in others. And then there is another book that has also produced evidence to show unequal democracy, to show that there is political polarization and reduced government responsiveness in nations, and this has serious consequences for all. Next slide. The spirit level. Now, this book is probably the best book about inequity and has produced the most compelling evidence about the effects of inequity on nations. It has been translated in 23 languages, sold 150,000 copies. And what are they saying? The title is Why Equality is Better for Everyone. That means it is good for even the very well-to-do. Next slide. If there is inequity in a nation, what happens is people view the inequity in the nation. In the olden days, they could be shielded, they could be cocooned, so that the rich would not come into contact with the poor. But in this day and age, because of the media and because of easy access to information, everybody, even the rich children, will know about the lives of the poor. And what happens then is, because of the inequity, there is an impact on mental health, drug abuse, education, imprisonment levels, obesity, social mobility, trust and community life, violence, teenage pregnancies, and child well-being. In fact, every aspect of our life is affected because of inequity. Next slide. Now, the problem is this. Our children and our grandchildren, if they live in an unequal society, then our children who may be teenagers will have children. They'll be teenage pregnancies. Even if you are very well-to-do, if you're living in an unequal society, the chances of your children or grandchildren going to jail are much higher than ever before. And our children and our grandchildren will get depressed, and and they will drop out from school because they can't find meaning, and they will self-destruct with alcohol and drugs, and they will be antisocial behavior. And so these are the effects of inequality. Next slide. And this is a quotation from the Lancet. It is now well established that the more unequal the society, the worse the outcomes for all, including those at the top. That means now we have to be worried. So long we thought inequality will affect the poor, but then we will, at a later date look into it and so on. We're postponing that, but now it is at the doorstep and it is important for us to act. Next slide. Now here is the evidence. Now this evidence has got meta-analysis. That means it has got a direct cause and effect relationship. Health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. Next. Levels of trust are higher in more equal countries. Next slide. The previous slide, levels of trust, it affects everything. It affects business, it affects economics, it affects GDP, so it can destroy a nation and make the nation poor. Levels of trust, next slide. The prevalence of mental health is higher in more unequal countries. Next slide. Drug use is more common in more unequal countries. Next slide. Life expectancy is longer in more equal rich countries. Next slide. Infant mortality rates are higher in more unequal countries. Next. More adults are obese in more unequal rich countries. Next slide. Education scores are higher in more equal rich countries. Next slide. Teenage birth rates are higher in more unequal rich countries. Next slide. Homicide rates are higher in more unequal rich countries. Children experience more conflict in more unequal societies. And rates of imprisonment are higher in more unequal countries. So you may have noticed that some things were higher in more unequal rich countries. So this is not a problem of the third world. This is a problem also of the first world. Next slide. So I have talked to you about the effects of inequity. And now how do we solve this? Now we have some theories of distributive justice. There are some theories that can be grouped together to call the egalitarianism. Everyone pays exactly the same and everyone gets the same. That is equality. The next theory is the utilitarianism. This means that whatever produces the most good for all, majority, that which produces the most happiness for the majority is just. And for those who miss out, there will be a trickle-down effect. So that is utilitarianism. And then there is the libertarianism, which is the market forces. Don't do anything. Allow the market forces to look after. And finally, I just want to quote John, is it Rawls or Rawls? He has the fairness principle. He says, inequality in distribution is fine if it helps everyone. Now, this is a good principle. Amartya Sen, the Indian Nobel Prize economist, also shares this view, the fairness principle. Let me just illustrate that by an example. Next slide. So again, this is John Rawls. He says, inequality is fine if it helps everyone. Next. Now, this is to help you understand the difference between equality and equity. Equality means sameness. So on the picture, is it my left, but it may be your right, entitled Equality, we have three boys. They are paid they bought a ticket for a football match or is it cricket, and then they're all being given one pedestal. So equality, that means they paid one price and they got a pedestal, everything's the same. But what happens is the tall boy can see very well, the boy in the middle can see enough, he's okay with that, but the boy who is short, he can't see anything. And so you take the pedestal from the tall boy and give it to the boy who is short, and then all three of them can see. So there is inequality, but there is equity. So this is what John Rod recommends, this is what Amartya Sen recommends, and this is what the God of the Bible also recommends. Next slide. This is what is there in the biblical in scriptures. In Leviticus 25, there are three salient obligations. One is the release of the slaves, the forgiveness of debts, and the repatriation of property. This happens in the Jubilee year. That means every 49 years, 7 into 7. So if you have bought a slave when you were in the 40th year, and then 9 years later, you had to release the slave. So, you put in a lot of investment in the slave, you taught him a lot of skills, probably taught him cooking and whatever other things. And then suddenly, now you have to set him free. Now, that is, it hurts the pockets of the well-to-do. Forgiveness of debts. Suppose you give money to somebody who needs it badly. That is in the year 45. Or let's say even if you give it in the first year, after 49 years, that money would multiply 100-fold. And then the time comes to just forgive him that debt. So, it hurts your pocket. It is very unequal. And then you have to repatriate the property. And so, this is the Jubilee principle. This principle was set in place to prevent trapping the poor in the poverty trap. Next slide. And that was done to protect nations from the effects of iniquity. God instituted that because there would be peace in the nation. Now, what happens if you don't do that? There will be iniquity, there will be injustice, and in the end, it can even lead to revolutions. You can have mini revolutions, you can have big revolutions. Arab Spring was a mini revolution, but the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution was extremely violent, and the Civil Rights Movement, because of the racial divides. So iniquity produces big impact, severe convulsions in a nation. And this is why the God of the Bible wanted that Jubilee principle to be embedded in our constitutions. Next slide. I will spare you because this is a little complicated, but I will explain it in the next slide. Next slide. Okay, now let me explain this a little better. The government subsidizes and gives free education to the poor and gives free health to the poor. But where does the government get that money? The government gets that money from the rich, because the rich have to pay more taxes. And so the money from the rich is used to subsidize the education for the poor and subsidize the health for the poor. And you can say this is not just, this is not equal, this is not right. But look at what happens. What happens then is the empowerment of the poor. They get educated and they become healthy. And when they become educated and become healthy, they get jobs. And then when they get jobs, they're able to get income. Some of them may start small enterprise. They may start a small vegetable shop or whatever. And because of these micro enterprises or even medium enterprises, they begin to make money. And just imagine if that happens in India, where 25% of the people are supposed to be low caste or backward class. And if they are suddenly educated, and if they are suddenly given a lot of health access, they will come into the economic sphere. They will begin to work. The economy will expand a great deal. And when the economy expands, the first people to benefit from an expanded economy are the rich, because they already have businesses in place. And when the economy expands, they begin to rake in profits and they become millionaires. And what the other benefit the rich will have is they will have more human resource available, because the poor have become educated, and they become the human resource for the rich to employ and for them to generate income. So what started off seemingly as a big loss was really an investment. The rich invested in the poor, and the poor expanded the economy, and in the end, the rich benefited. And this is why this is a biblical principle, and this is why equity is so very important. Next slide. Now we will look at the causes of inequality and the causes of inequity. Now there are two important causes. One is the global political determinants of health, that is perpetuating ill health and poverty. And the next is the social determinants of health that you all probably know. People don't talk too much about the political determinants of health because it's a somewhat sensitive issue. Next slide. But the political determinants of health are the more important. And this is the definition: global political interaction across all sectors. That means across business, across agriculture, across defense, everything. Global political interaction across all sectors that affect health are what we call global political determinants of health. Next slide. Now, these are the 5 big global factors that produce severe poverty and therefore produce ill health. And what are these 5? One is the arms, the defense industry, the manufacturing of arms and buying of arms, and then the debt because of the loans most of the developing countries have taken, and then the corruption that is there even in the most Christian countries in the world, and then the war and the displacement, the refugees, and then the climate change. Next slide. I'm not going to talk too much about climate change because that is not really important, but this is just to let you know that climate change affects every aspect of life. It affects water, agriculture, business, environment. Next slide. Now, this is a little difficult slide, but it's an important slide if we have to understand why there is perpetual poverty. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, they have what is called the Structural Adjustment Program. Now, what is that Structural Adjustment Program? That means if you take a loan of $1 billion, if your country takes that loan, you then have to do away with protectionism. That means you have to allow the whole world, goods from the whole world, to compete with your own goods made in your country. They may be made by very poor people in small shops. Now they have to compete with multinationals that produce millions of objects at a very low cost, and they flood in and they come into your country and they kill all the small businesses. And then you have to do away with welfare. If you take that loan, then you cannot give free education, you cannot give free health benefits. And that means you cannot bring the poor out of the poverty track. You have to use this money only for building roads and bridges and use it for starting new mining industries and stuff like that. You cannot give subsidies to farmers. Let me not go through all of that. Finally, you have to pay back in hard currency. That means if you take a loan of $1 billion, you cannot give it back in Tanzanian shillings. You have to give it back in dollars with interest. Now, how do you give back the dollars with interest? You don't have it. So you have to export some products from your country. But then you cannot export it to all countries. You have to export it to only those countries which have the hard currency. That means you can export it to only those 5, 6, 7 countries. So you have 150 countries trying to sell to 5, 6, 7 countries, and there is severe competition, and you will get a rock bottom price for your products. But you have to do it because you want to get hard currency and because you have to pay back the debt. With the result, next slide. Okay, I'll just some details about each of them. Arms trade, each year, $45 to $60 billion worth of arms are agreed for sale. And there's a quotation from the US president. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket that's fired, in the final sense, is a theft from those who hunger and are not fed. Next slide. And the arms, this is the final effect of what happens because of the structural adjustment program. All the African countries, and in fact, all the developing countries, including India, they are in debt. But then it's not wrong to have debt. Everyone can borrow, but the debt has to be in control. But the debts of most of the developing countries, this is out of control. For example, you can see some countries on the right-hand side. Their debt is 159% of the GDP. That means if they work day and night, they have to give all of that back as servicing the debt and some of the capital. There is nothing left for education, nothing left for health. So then, what can you do? How can you improve the health of your country if you're so indebted? Next slide. The net result of everything, the arms trade and the structural adjustment and all that is this. $5 trillion go from the southern nations, which is developing countries, to the northern nations because they are buying arms and because they have to import oil and many other things, technology which they don't have at all, and then they have to service the debt. And from the north to the south, they get only $2 trillion. And out of that, a lot of it is aid money. It's like charity. And some of it is trade. Next slide. This is not about thinking about victim and victimizers. We are not talking about demonizing the North and victim, having a victim approach to the South, because we know that if the victimizer is the global, if the developing nations become developed and the developed nations become the developing nations, the result would be exactly the same, because it would be a reverse kind of domination. So this is not about who is the victim and who is the victimizer. We are all the same because human heart is wicked. Our battle is not against the global North. Our battle is not against the global South or any other country. Our battle is against the principalities and powers that has darkened the minds of both the global North and the global South. And there is actually no easy solution even the government of United States, even the president of United States, not even the G7 countries, not even the G20 countries can rock this boat, because this boat is many, many $1 trillion huge. And anyone who rocks the boat will lose his job, and no one will do it. And so we can wonder now what can be done. But there is one solution. We are Christians. And next slide. And this is a quotation from Blaise Pascal. He says, God instituted prayer to communicate to creatures the dignity of causality. If there is anyone who can change this, it is not the President of the United States or G7 or G20. They are the Christian people, including everyone here in this room. We can, through prayer, bring about a change, and we can reverse this trend. We can bring the poor people out of the poverty trap. So that is the only solution. I was talking about the victim and the victimizer, and it's important to understand well, because in this conference, the ICMDA is a subculture of the world's culture. And in this subculture, there are no enemy nations and there are no enemies. The Russians are here, along with the Ukrainians, along with the Europeans, and there are Pakistanis here, and there are Indians here, and we are very good friends. And so in this subculture, there are no enemy nations. We know that because we know the evil is right inside us. We don't have to look at our neighbor. Next slide. Now, social determinants of health. I'm sure a lot of public health experts know a lot about these determinants, but for the sake of some of the others who may not know this, poverty, we have discussed that. Education and literacy levels are extremely important, but what is very important is the female literacy. There has been clinching evidence that female literacy is exceptionally important in the health of the family. And so we need to focus especially on female literacy, and especially on the Islamic countries where women are not allowed to go to school. And then job and food security, that is easy to understand. Housing and environment, that is also easy to understand. Prejudice and exclusion, disability, the disabled people, if you may not have known this, but there is now evidence that the output of a disabled person is always more than the output of a so-called normal person. But we have prejudice and we don't employ them. And then the gender bias and the race bias and the caste bias, which is there in India, and the religious bias. But one of the most important thing is what Lawrence Harrison says in his book called the underdevelopment is a state of mind. Now, this is very important. What happens to the poor after 1, 2, 3 generations of poverty? The poor people cannot even dream about getting out of the poverty trap. They take it as fate. They can never believe that it is ever possible. And so that perpetuates the poverty. And so underdevelopment is a state of mind. And so empowerment of the mind is such an important role and very important for Christian people to do, especially dealing with the poor. And then, of course, corruption, both micro-corruption and the corruption at the macro levels. Next slide. This is just put down in a different format. Next slide. Now, this is the more practical part. What can we do nationally? What can we do locally? Yes, about the political determinants of health, we will continue to pray and continue to wrestle so that there is some change. But we cannot simply keep quiet because we have to do something more. And so I have some suggestions, I think about 8 of the 8 suggestions for our national organizations to be able to do so as to fight inequity. Next, first is advocate increased funding for health in our own countries and in our own state and in our own districts. Normally, anything less than 2% is, I think what is needed is something like 5%, but most countries spend less than 2%. And so we have to encourage people, governments, contacts that you have, Christian ministers that you may know, challenge them to increase the funding for health. And then when they increase the funding from, say, 1.5% to, let's say, 4%, then that funding should be not used for building hospitals. On the first day, we heard the health minister here say he wanted more hospitals, but I just beg to disagree. I think if they increase the funding, it should not be used for building more hospitals. It should be sent to, it should be invested in primary care. And so advocate increase in primary care. In India, 28% of the 2% is used for primary care, but it should be like 50%. And in India, 72% of the 2% is used for tertiary care, building big hospitals. But I think that needs to go down to 50% because that way you will bring the poor out of the poverty trap. And when the poor come out of the poverty trap, it will explode the economy and more poor people, everybody will become rich. And then alternative human resource for health. This is also called task shifting. This is to reduce doctor dependency and the use of technology in healthcare, which is now available more and more, which can reduce doctor dependency. You know, doctors are the most costliest part of healthcare, and the room rent, hospital room rent, is the next highest. And so if you reduce doctor dependency, then you are actually making health more sustainable. And then these are 3 other things that you can do. Community-based health initiatives with vocational training. You know, you can't simply do community health in your area without doing something to help them to generate income. In a lot of the work in India, beside in what the mission hospitals do is they also are involved in vocational training, micro enterprise, helping people to get jobs and do some work so that they are able to pay for healthcare. And then community-based health initiatives can include church schools, electronic church schools, but that is not a subject for discussion now. But you can just make a note of that because it is very possible. Software is available. You can have a school just in a church hall, and you can begin to have without permission of the government, without registering a school, you can begin to educate people. They can go to open school and pass an exam and then get into the mainstream. And then cooperative village pharmacies using generic drugs. Now, I don't know whether it is possible in other countries who import drugs to have generic drugs, but in India, we have what is called generic drugs. We have generic branded, and we have branded. But if you use generic drugs, it is extremely cheap, and you can start village pharmacies and provide drugs at a very cheap cost. And then there is also what is called home-based care and telehealth with the use of miniaturized tele-gadgets. This is what I'm starting and trying to make it sustainable. Next slide. Health spending, I was telling you that India spends 2%, Tanzania spends 1.8%. I think he should be challenged to spend at least 4%. You can see UK spends 10% of their GDP on and this is the reason why they have a good health system. USA spends 18%, but the mistake the US has made is most of that money is going to hospitals. It's not going to primary health care. And so their health system, the health impact is very below normal. I will show you that. Next slide. This is what the US is doing. They have the biggest health budget in the world, and they spend it all on hospitals and technology and not on primary care. And so what happens is their longevity is much less than people in Chile, which spends much more money on primary care, and therefore their longevity is so much more, the health impact is so much more. And so this is a very important lesson for us to learn. Government should spend more money, and that more money should go more to primary care than to secondary care or tertiary care. Next slide. There is plenty of evidence that primary care countries will investment in primary health care produces more impact than spending on tertiary care. Next slide. In the previous slide, sorry. In the previous slide, you remember the big declaration WHO made in 1948. That was extremely ambitious and probably impractical. But in 1978, they came up with a very practical suggestion, the Alma-Ata Declaration on Primary Health. They said primary health should be the focus of all nations. And if we do that, you will have health for all by 2000 AD. Next slide. And then what kind of specialists should we need for a nation? There is again plenty of evidence that the family medicine approach is pro-poor. People will benefit more. The health indicators will improve if you have more family medicine specialists than brain surgeons or thoracic surgeons. And so family medicine people so far have been just taught to refer away. They are just being used as triaging doctor, but they need to do more. And if they can resolve more, then they can reduce cost for the patient. And so this is why ICMDA has got the program called Refer Less, Resolve More. And this is why ICMDA is interested in family medicine, because it is a pro-poor specialty. Next slide. I've already said that. There are many reasons why it is so very important. Family medicine, patient-centered, and because it is patient-centered, it is more suited for helping them with emotional problems and helping them with spiritual problems. And it decreases referrals. It has the care continuum. You know, they don't have to go from doctor to doctor. The same doctor will have the history and will have the EMR. And so he knows where this person is going in his health journey. And they become advocates for the patient. When he is referred to some specialist, the family medicine doctor will keep a tab on what is really happening. Next slide. And then this is alternative human resource for health. The Christian doctor and the non-Christian doctor, one big difference is this. The Christian doctor works towards decreasing doctor dependency. The non-Christian doctor works towards increasing doctor dependency. And so, since the Christian doctor wants to reduce doctor dependency, he should also be interested in developing alternative human resource for health. In a lot of the Christian hospitals in India, we have nurse practitioners is not recognized by the country, but we have them trained as midwives. They do a lot of OBGYN work. And so just one doctor is enough with a lot of these midwives. They can conduct a lot of deliveries. There are hospitals in India where they have Christian hospitals in India where they have only one OBGYN, but they have like, some 10,000, 15,000 deliveries a year. Just one OBGYN conducting 15,000 deliveries a year. That is possible because of alternative health human resource. And then we have anesthesia nurse practitioners. I myself have trained nurses to give spinal anesthesia. And so I take the responsibility if something goes wrong. But the nurses become so good that now she can do it better than I. So, and then you can have, there are several other examples of, creating alternative human resource for health. If you can change the policy in your country, if you have influence, you can challenge the government to increase alternative human resource for health so that the healthcare costs go down. Next slide. And same thing, that is a task shifting. They have pride in their work. A doctor may not feel so good when he gives a good spinal, but if you teach a nurse to give a good spinal and when she does it, she feels really good and she takes pride in her work and she'll do it meticulously. It's financially sustainable. They cannot migrate and go off to the US. They have more time for patient communication, and due to repetition, they become better than doctors. This is what I was saying. Next slide. Community-based health insurance. This is not the place to give you details about community health insurance. My time is actually up. But I'm sure you can ask ChatGPT and they will tell you a lot about community-based health insurance. These are the components of the community-based insurance. You have the community, someone needs to take the trouble to collect money. That is, you are the NGO, you collect money from the community, you get connected to a big insurance company and the insurance company pays the hospital. And so this is the model. And next slide. There are just more details about how much they pay and so on and so forth. I might leave this PowerPoint with you so that you will have these details. Next slide. Next slide. Effectiveness is about 25%. That means for patients, it will help with 25% of a patient's expenses if you have this community-based insurance program. Next slide. Next slide. This community-based health insurance is it's not a substitute for primary health care. It is actually complementing whatever you're already doing. Next slide. This is about generic drugs. Next slide. This may or may not be relevant in all countries, but this is a village pharmacy where drugs are kept. You can have a cooperative. The village people pool money together. If you employ a pharmacist and then he manages, and they take the profit from that. Next slide. This is what I'm doing now, train home-based care workers, but I don't want to talk about it now because my time is up. Just go through the slides quickly and finish it. These are the technology tools we use to provide home-based care. The home-based care worker, we do not have the handheld ultrasound because it is not legal yet in India, but we know a company who can give us this once it becomes legal. And we have a smart stethoscope that is connected to Wi-Fi, and you can transmit the sound from the home by a health worker. It goes to the doctor far away. You can send ECGs far away through Wi-Fi. Next slide. And next slide. And okay, so this is the summary of what we can do nationally. Advocate increase in funding for health, advocate family medicine, advocate alternative human resource, community-based insurance, cooperative pharmacies, home-based care, and leveraging technology. You can actually, Professor John Wyatt was talking about the AI demon, but if Christians can use it before the non-Christian use it and make it a demon, Christian can use it to make decision-making algorithms and use it and decrease doctor dependency. Thank you. Doctor dependency. Thank you.